Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to have you join us for the third installment of our Clinton School Center on Community Philanthropy Leadership Forum series. Today's topic is on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We initiated this series with best practices. Our second installment looked at evaluation. And today you're going to get a very deep dive from the best expert in the field on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Charlotte Williams. I'm Associate Professor and Director of the Center on Community Philanthropy here at the Clinton School. I want to welcome all of you here. I want to recognize a few people in the audience. I want to recognize our ex-chancellor, Joel Anderson, former chancellor of the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. I want to recognize John Kirk. He's the current director of the Joel Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity. I want to recognize Dr. Sharice West Scantlebury, President and CEO of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation and long-term partner of the Clinton School Center on Community Philanthropy. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Our keynote speaker is Susan Batten. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Black Foundation Executives, which is known as ABFE. Susan has been in that position since 2009. She has over 20 years of experience working with for-profits, non-for-profits, philanthropic institutions, doing directing, evaluation, and helping these organizations create initiatives that improve the outcome for vulnerable children and families. Susan has accolades and awards that are too numerous to announce. But one I want to specifically lift up is that she received the Change Agent of the Year award that's given out by the Schott Family Foundation for Education. Susan completed her undergraduate degree at Fisk University, where she studied English and political science. And I just recently found out that she's a fellow Bison, and she did her graduate work at Howard University studying in social work. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Susan Batten.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Gosh, I just feel like Charlotte did my whole bio without a note or anything. I am just so impressed, and thank you for the love. It is good to be here in Little Rock, given that flight I had last night over that very rough storm. I landed and was just pleased to be safe. And it's been several years since I've been here, so it's good to be back. I want to thank the full team here at the Clinton School, Charlotte, all of the colleagues here for allowing me to come and share with you some of my thoughts and my lessons around this big issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And Charlotte said I was one of the experts. I think I am learning as much as we all are on these issues. I appreciate that, but I've been at this work for quite some time. By way of background, the organization that I lead does in fact advise foundations on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Organization's been around for almost 50 years now, and was really seen as the key organization in the field of philanthropy to help diversify the foundation sector in particular. So, and prior to ABFE, I was at the Annie E. Casey Foundation with my friends Corey Anderson and Sharice West, and I too, there, while at that organization, helped that foundation think about issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So this has been my work for about the last 20 years, and it's tough work. It's tough work, which is why I think this room is as crowded as it is today. And you know, I have to say that not much has changed in the sector. So there's a big punchline, and that's not to get us down as we dive into this issue, but when we think about the representation and diversity in the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector, not much has changed. And I think there are specific reasons for that. I'll share them. But this work is tough. And there are times when you just get frustrated and you start wringing your hands. And I keep thinking maybe my dream to go sell jewelry and sandals on the beach is something that actually I am going to do one day. And I've been spending a lot more time actually doing that. I will have to say that. But then we have weeks in this country like we had last week, right? And it reminds me why we all have to care and how we all have to ensure that this country is one where everybody can thrive, has access to opportunity, and can live free from bias and discrimination, right? Think about it, in just 1 week, and I know it's weighed heavy on me, so I'm sure it's weighed heavy on all of us, we witnessed attempted bombings on several citizens around this country based on political hatred and bias, a mass shooting in Pittsburgh based on religious hatred and bias, and the assassination of 2 citizens in Louisville, Kentucky, right, based on racial hatred and bias. And these events are very much tied to this big, broad idea around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and just illustrates the continued struggle that we have in this country to accept and embrace our differences. So hopefully we're all reminded, I thought maybe I'd have to stand here and talk about why these issues matter, but coming off of last week, I think it's a big reminder to all of us that we've got a lot of work to do. And the nonprofit sector in particular has a huge, huge role to play. First and foremost, ensuring that we are actually employing diverse people with diverse thinking and points of view. And second, by doing work in communities to ensure that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, ability, have access to opportunity. So what I thought I'd do today is just walk through a few things. One, I'm going to spend a little time talking about these words, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because I think often we make the assumption that we're all on the same page when we're talking about these issues. So I always start just by defining. I'm going to give you a frame, the frame that we use at AbbVie and how I think about these issues. And also talk a little bit about how these very important issues are interconnected, but to suggest we need to really put our dime on issues of equity. Diversity and inclusion matter, but to really begin to push ourselves to think about equity. 3, I want to make a case as to why racial equity in particular might be the door that we go through that helps us deal with other forms of oppression and bias and discrimination. And lastly, I'll just share some thoughts with you about lessons that I've learned about how to start this work in nonprofits and foundations and how to sustain work over time. So that's the agenda. I'm going to try to do that in about 20 minutes, which will be pretty amazing. But first, let me see if I can get the clicker going. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. Let's see if I can do this. This is my family. And, we know each other through our titles and the work that we do, but I am Jean Taylor and Jimmy Taylor's daughter. So this is my family sitting on the steps of my home in Long Island, New York, where I grew up. And, there are times when, I'd like to think that I really sought out a career around these issues. Actually, sometimes you look for careers, other times careers find you, right? And so I actually come from a family of helping professionals. My dad was, along the gentleman making the really funny face, he was a comedian to his heart. He was a long-term educator in Brownsville, Brooklyn. He taught schools in Brownsville for about 40 years in a pretty tough neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. And when he wasn't teaching schools during the day, he was running youth centers at night. And on the weekends, my father and his other friends who were also educators used to run homework clubs in my basement. I could never get away from studying and doing homework because my dad really opened the doors of our home to folks in the community for mentoring and tutoring and ensuring that your homework was right and correct. My mom, sitting in the checked dress in the front, was a community health nurse in Long Island, New York as well. And I'd like to say and believe that she helped raise several generations of folks in Wyandanch. Again, another very diverse and pretty tough neighborhood in Long Island. My two sisters were actually teachers. My brother, who actually took another path, he was probably the smartest of all of us, and went into technology and music. He was also the best looking, I think. He took another path, and that's me down in the front with the wedge heels and the crooked braids. But I really came from a family of helping professions, and as I say, I didn't think I would be moving into this work, but I just think that the work chose me. My path to philanthropy was not so linear or straight as well. I'm a social worker by training. I came out of Howard with an MSW, and I was carrying a child welfare caseload in Washington, D.C. And I got tapped by a consulting firm that was doing work with national foundations around the country, looking at the impact of their investments in predominantly communities of color on children and youth issues. And one of the clients was the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and that's actually how I got into a foundation. And I think I had 3 job offers before I took the position at Annie E. Casey, because while I was doing work with national foundations, I was always very skeptical and concerned about the power dynamics between very large, privileged funders, right, and the poor communities, predominantly communities of color, that they were investing in. But there was a really big vision for something called Making Connections, and Corey and Sharice will chuckle at the memory of the development of that work. This was an initiative starting in the late 90s, and it was an effort in 22 neighborhoods to actually let families lead in terms of the design of the agenda to make their neighborhoods safer places and stronger places to raise kids and families. So I actually was very intrigued by that, and that's what made me sort of take the 3rd job offer at Annie E. And it was amazing work. It was innovative at the time. It was going to be a 10-year initiative. And there were struggles along the way, but I will say larger struggles, probably midway through that investment. And one of the big barriers that we were dealing with is that we didn't, as a foundation, have our own sort of act together around issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Here we were working in some of the poorest neighborhoods around the country, predominantly black and brown neighborhoods. There was diversity at Annie E at that time, but just like any other institution, it's not just our sector, right? The higher up you go in a large institution, the less diverse the leadership is. So we had our senior leadership deployed in many of these communities around the country, and we were struggling. So I actually took a position. It was created, it's not the one I was hired for, but it was created to help the foundation think through issues around equity, inclusion, and diversity, both internally as it relates to what we were going to do ourselves in terms of diversity of our staff, our vendors, and our grantees, as well as externally, sort of supporting a portfolio to address issues of racial equity in particular in communities that we were funding in. And what I learned from this work is probably what a lot of us know, that this work is hard and it takes a lot of intentionality. You have to be intentional around addressing issues of difference. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm going to get up and I'm going to run out and I'm going to just do everything about working with people that are different than me. That's not how we wake up in the morning, right? So intentionality is actually critically important. The second is a commitment to learning. You know, when I was at Casey managing the work in Providence, Rhode Island, it was a predominantly Latino community. I'm African American, right? And so I was struggling myself, just in terms of how I support families that were speaking another language as their first language, right? How I brought their concerns back to the foundation. So there's a lot of learning involved in this work. And then lastly, I think that tools and guardrails about how to do this work is extremely important. Because again, it's us sort of getting out of our comfort zones and working through issues of difference. So I was at KC for about 9 years when the position opened up for the CEO slot at AbbVie. I took that position, and I saw that it was an opportunity to work with many more foundations around their struggles on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And one of the areas of work that we do now at AbbVie is philanthropic advising. So we're working with thousands of foundation professionals around the country on issues of diversity and the like. And I'll tell you, just like the struggles we had at Annie Casey, those are similar struggles that our colleagues are having and probably are relevant to you as well in terms of language, developing a shared point of view, and then figuring out how to move in this space on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. So that's the context that I bring to this work. That's how I enter the conversation today. So I want to begin by making no assumptions, as I said, and start off with a little bit of data and definitions around EDI, so I can do a little level setting. And I always call it go slow to go fast, right? So I'm going to lean on some data actually that comes from a study called The State of Diversity in Nonprofit Leadership by Vitalia Winston. This was in 2017. And it actually looked at the largest 300, the 300 largest nonprofits and foundations in this country, right? Just to look at the demographics. And first, it gives us a little bit of information about the value of diverse leadership teams. And this was a look at the very top. So they were looking at CEOs and boards of the largest nonprofits in this country. So we understand, and I think you all are here because you believe that diversity matters, and it actually does influence the effectiveness and the impact that we have in community, right? Better connected to all populations. If we're diverse in our institutions, we are better at connecting with diverse populations on the ground. This last note I think is really interesting, and it's a perpetual issue that I think we see happening in nonprofits and foundations. Boards that are not diverse will just perpetuate the lack of diversity, right? Again, it's actually human nature that we hang out with and are with people that are just like us. As I say, nobody runs out with the intention of being with somebody that's not like them. And so when we look at the top echelon, we look at the governance of the largest nonprofits and foundations in this country, and we see a lack of diversity, we know that we have got to intentionally get in there and get some work done. Otherwise, it's just going to recycle itself over and over again. But this is the data from the study itself. And again, this is a snapshot of the largest 300 nonprofits in America. 42% have women CEOs. You see the data around racial ethnic leadership. Two interesting points. The richer the organization, the less gender diversity at the top, right? When we look at some of the largest organizations. Organizations with annual budgets greater than 50 million just have 18% women as CEOs. And often when women get into the C-suite, we are paid less. So there's still issues clearly around gender disparities and pay disparities. This study actually looks specifically, more intentionally, around issues of race and gender. I know there are other sort of points of diversity that we're concerned about. But again, just a high-level snapshot of what one study found. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, these numbers haven't changed much at all, right? Small growth, but not huge numbers. So with that, I want to jump into a little bit of a drill down in these concepts, right, of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I actually think there's been not much progress on these issues, and there are a couple of things, and we can get into a conversation afterwards about what we think is driving the slow progress in this area. But the lack of competency and understanding around issues of equity, diversity and inclusion, race in this country, racism in particular, I think are huge issues for the sector to deal with. So, and I know, again, there's also bias and just flat out discrimination and prejudice, and we got to be real about that, right? We all have biases. We all have biases because we've been socialized in the United States that paints a particular image around people of color, immigrants, women. So we all bring that to the table, right? And we've got one part of the work that we all have to do is check our own biases. But I also believe that we just don't spend enough time talking about these concepts and what they mean. So I'm just going to give you a way in which we think about it at AbbVie. Just to, and again, there are many definitions, there are many frameworks. I'm just going to ask you to try this one on for about 15 more minutes, right? Before we have a conversation. So we see these issues as connected but very distinct, right? Connected but very distinct. I'm starting over on the right-hand side. Diversity is really the conversations that we often are having in the field. It's just about difference, right? It's the many ways in which we are different. Diversity is about representation, right? So it could be about race, it could be about gender, it could be about sexual orientation, it could be about class, the many ways in which we are different as people. Inclusion is actually something different, right? Inclusion is more about organizational culture and environments that actually value diverse people, diverse opinions, right? Diverse preferences and the like. And I will just say, I think this is where we're struggling in the sector, in the nonprofit sector. And I see, particularly as it relates to foundations, I see diverse talent coming in every day. We actually have a fellowship program where we identify 10 mid-career African Americans every year to come into a fellowship program. And by the time their year-long fellowship program is over, half of them have left the sector. And it's because of the issues of inclusion. So I think in this sector, we need to be talking about inclusion. I actually have heard many foundations start to talk about now, no, we're not having diversity initiatives anymore. We're having inclusion initiatives now. Because now is the time that we need to start thinking about how do we organize ourselves so that we're accepting of the diverse talent that we're bringing in. If we don't change ourselves and the ways in which we work, we can't keep the diverse talent that we're bringing in. So that's inclusion, more about organizational culture and environment. Then there's equity. And equity is really about, I explain the results we want to see in the world, right? And usually comes from changing practices and policies of big public systems and institutions, typically meaning that we're removing policies and practices that disadvantage some groups and advantage other groups, right? So equity is really about the results that we want to see. And I often think if we would start the conversation about diversity, really about what is it that we want to see at the end of the day, and that's actually all people doing better with the elimination of gender gaps, racial disparity gaps, gaps as it relates to health for LGBTQ populations, maybe we'd be having another conversation about diversity, right? We say diversity is necessary but not sufficient to get to equity. And whenever I hear a foundation say that we're going to hire, we need more diverse staff, and I say, why? Why is it that you need more diverse staff? What is it that you want to see at the end of the day, right? In conversations in New York with some funders that were talking about trying to increase the high school graduation rates of black males. So their solution was to hire more black teachers. That's a diversity solution. Absolutely necessary, absolutely important. But if we actually don't change the school discipline policies that disproportionately push out black boys, we may not see the high school graduation numbers that we want to see, right? Another tougher example I will just share is, when you think about sort of the spate of shootings of unarmed black men around the country, very hard, tough issues to deal with. And many communities are talking about, we need to hire more Latino, and black police officers. Absolutely necessary. But that's just a diversity solution. If we just do that and don't change policies like stop and frisk that disproportionately pull over Black men and Latino men, we may not see the number of shootings go down. So you all get where I'm going? It's like diversity is necessary but not sufficient to get to equity, and equity is really what we want to see in terms of the closing of disparity gaps. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on equity because, again, I think this is where we want the sector to focus a bit more. Another way to talk about equity, another way to think about it. Equity is the fair treatment and advancement for all people. It requires the elimination of barriers that prevent the full participation of some groups. And improving equity involves ensuring that policies and processes of institutions or systems don't advantage some groups over others, right? So when we're talking equity, it's not just about mixing up folks that have different opinions and different backgrounds vis-a-vis race and gender. We're talking about changing policies and protocols of systems and institutions and large nonprofits and foundations, right, to ensure that we can keep the diverse talent, build inclusive environments, and the like. Another way to think about equity. We think equity actually can be measured. And I'm going to use the racial equity frame because, again, that's mostly the work that we do at AbbVie. And we say it like this. Equity is achieved when you can't predict advantage or disadvantage by race, right? When you can't look at a chart of chronic absenteeism, right, in schools and know that the big bar, well, those are probably the people of color, those are probably the white kids, those are probably, when you can't predict advantage or disadvantage by race. And I would say the same about gender equity, right? You can't predict advantage or disadvantage by gender. And this can be measured. We propose it can be measured by closing gaps in racial disparities. This is actually, or gender disparities. This is actually data from Oakland Unified School District, and I don't know if you all can see, all the way on the left are their percent of African American males who are chronically absent. And the middle bar is all students in Oakland Unified School District, and the last bar are white males. And you see where we drew the line, where we want everybody to do better. This is what equity is about. We want everybody to do better while we simultaneously close gaps in disparities. Because when we see disparities, when we see gaps like this, it means something's going on, and it is not necessarily that the people are bad, but the systems that are touching them are disproportionately biased and discriminating against them. Here's another bar. I told you I'm going to push equity. Another slide in which we help folks talk about what we're looking for in the world vis-a-vis equity. It's possible to improve outcomes, raise the bar without achieving equity, which is closing the gaps. And we need to do both. This is actually the percent of adult Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian males in the US population who complete a 4-year college degree. So you see, over time, we're actually doing better in this country in terms of men completing a 4-year college degree, but what remains? What happens? Still a gap, right? There's still a gap. So when we talk about equity, right, diversity matters, we need more representation, inclusion matters because we need to keep the diverse talent in the field, but, and we need to ensure that that happens for all communities, right? So that communities are best served by nonprofits, foundations. But at the end of the day, we want to see, this is actually suggesting, we want to see the closing of disparities based on gender, based on race, right? Based on sexual orientation, as we think about doing diversity work in our nonprofit institutions and in foundations. So we focus a lot, as I say, on racial diversity and equity at AbbVie, but it's important to note that there are many forms of diversity, right? And so part of what makes this work hard is that we actually have to think about all of these things. So there's diversity as relates to gender, class, sexual orientation, and the like. And doing intentional work around diversity, equity, and inclusion means that we are paying attention to each of these population groups, that we're taking the time. That's why it's hard. And that's why we sometimes in the nonprofit community and the foundation community, we're moving so fast and we're all doing great work, but sometimes we need to slow it down and really think about how are we touching, right, folks of diverse backgrounds. So we've got to think about all of this, and that's why some folks talk about the importance of an intersectional lens, and that's what this is suggesting, that we need to take the time, again, to think about all the ways in which we're different and how our investments and how our programs are either advantaging folks, disadvantaging others based on their difference. We would suggest, however, that when doing intersectional work, we've got to keep race on the table. We actually have to keep race on the table, right? Because race matters significantly in this country. On almost every indicator of well-being, I don't care what you're working on, health, justice, education, child welfare, we see disparities based on race. So as we talk with foundations around the country and they're doing work around women's issues of the LGBTQ population, we actually suggest, but don't let race fall off the table because race is significant. There are two examples here. Some data that you probably know, the LGBTQ population experiences worse health outcomes than their heterosexual counterparts. They're actually at higher risk for cancer, mental illness, and other diseases. And that's due to factors like low rates of health insurance and high rates of stress due to harassment and discrimination, quite frankly. However, people who are both LGBTQ and are people of color often face the highest levels of health disparities because they're being hit with bias vis-a-vis sexual orientation and race combined, right? Another point about women. Women of all races earn less than their male counterparts. However, women of color experience wider gaps in earnings because they're faced with gender bias and racial bias combined. So again, it's important when we're talking about diversity to pay attention about how we're supporting people of difference, but we're also suggesting to you, I'm suggesting to you that we have to keep race on the table because race is such a significant dynamic in this country. We have to keep race front and center. So I talk fast because I'm a New Yorker, but I want to sort of wrap up with a few last slides about doing work on diversity, equity, and inclusion and embedding work in organizations. And then we can just have a conversation. I'm looking forward to that. The material that I'm going to share with you comes from something called the D5 initiative that was a huge effort in the philanthropic sector to increase diversity within foundation ranks. And I think it's actually relevant to nonprofits as well. But let me share a bit about, first, embedding DEI work in your organization. And again, this is probably, this is not new to many of you, but again, I don't make assumptions about where people are. And hopefully we can have, again, a conversation and would love to hear sort of where you are in this work and suggestions that you have. So what this does is actually give a set of key questions. This D5, there was a scan that they did on policies and practices of foundations, and there are several questions that they say all nonprofit institutions, whether you're service institutions or foundations, should be asking themselves around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then also gives you some indicators to consider about whether or not you're making progress, along the way. So the first, has the organization made an expressed commitment, I would say a public expressed commitment to these values and principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you'll see the importance of vision and mission statements. We worked with a number of foundations, facilitated conversations, helped them get through how to connect this very important issue to the mission of your organization. I don't know one, and if I took a poll, I don't know one nonprofit organization, if you gave me your mission, that we couldn't say this was front and center and central to you being impactful, right, and actually achieving your mission and your visionary work. So that's important work for all of us to do in terms of our organizations. The second, has the organization authorized DEI in organizational policy? So you see it lifts up the importance of institutionalization of this very important issue. It's pretty clear from where I sit and what studies have shown, particularly on foundations, that the rhetoric actually doesn't match the policy in funding organizations around the country. So we talk a lot about this in the sector, but are we actually institutionalizing the importance of these values and principles in our policies around the board, our policies around the staff, our policies around vendors? I think diversity and equity issues needs to go beyond just the board and staff and really think about people that we're hiring to do work with us as an organization. So understanding, again, the rhetoric often leads, but the policy lags, and that's critically important when we're talking about transitions in leadership and the like. The third question, has the organization implemented DEI practices in operations? And you notice a few sort of points here. It talks about the active inclusion of diverse members on the board, and I highlight active inclusion. Again, the notion that it's not just enough to get diverse folks on your board. You know, we are skirting tokenism if we just put folks on our board and don't put them in key positions to lead key committees and the like. And again, this takes intention. So active inclusion of diverse members on our board, efforts to create a pipeline of increasingly diverse potential board members that actually, again, takes work to get out of your social network and figure out how to get more talent to the governance of nonprofit organizations. Active inclusion of diverse members of the staff. Again, we've got a number of members. We have about 800 members in our organization. Many of our colleagues are the only person of color, right, in their foundation. Right? That's the reality of the diversity of the sector. And again, the concerns around tokenism and our ability to retain folks, right? We can't bring diverse talent in if we're actually not going to be inclusive and use their brilliance, their guidance, and their networks as well. For larger organizations, support for internal affinity groups, right? Sometimes folks that are different and in the minority just need their own space, right, to talk about the issues. We did a lot of that within the foundation that Sharice and Corey and I worked at, but it's allowing for that kind of space. Again, this is typically for larger organizations, and ensure that ideas that come from those affinity groups actually get into decision-making, you know, conversations and tables for the organization. And then last one, this is specifically for foundations, but I love to push foundations as much as I can, so I will just add this. Grant payment processes that recognize that grantees are differently situated, right? Not all grantee organizations can be on that same schedule to get their grant check. You know, imagine you're in a small organization. If it's a small organization, it's more likely to be led by a person of color. And it's also more likely to be more closely connected to the ground and connected to people. Having small organizations on the same payment schedules with large foundations just doesn't make sense, right? So really thinking about how we sort of implement and institutionalize as relates to practices in our operating structures. And then the last, has it implemented DEI practices in programming? And a few points I would just make here. And again, I don't think these are new concepts for folks, but just in case, I want to go over a few. One, programming that systematically assesses the perspective of diverse constituent groups, right? Meaning that we just need to take the time to check in and talk with folks of different racial ethnic backgrounds about the work that the organization is doing. Folks of different sexual orientations, right? Folks in our community with differing abilities. That's actually a practice that we have to make normal in the work that we do in our organizations if in fact we want to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Programming that is led by people most impacted by the issue, right? So I know all of us are in the nonprofit sector. We know the importance of ensuring that the constituents who we purport to serve and support are instrumental in the design and the evaluation of what's working for them. Programming that comprehends the ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion inequities are produced and maintained, right? So that the organization actually does some work itself to try to figure out what is driving the racial disparities for Asian American girls in our community. What is driving the health disparities for trans people in our community, right? That an organization takes the time to engage those populations to understand disparities, and then, again, designs programming based on that theory of change. And then lastly, programming that appreciates how the various dimensions of diversity interact and intersect. And there, the study is talking about how race intersects with gender, right? How, race intersects with sexual preference and the like. So these are just some points about implementing DEI practices in programming. So I'm going to sort of end. I know I'm giving a lot to you, but that's usually how I do it, try to get as much out so we can have a conversation, with some thoughts, again, coming from this D5 study about what's important to start diversity, equity, and inclusion work in this sector, and then what's important to sustain it over time. And again, you all are doing this work, but maybe you'll find or hear one or two things that make you go, So one, first and foremost, in terms of to start the work is leadership. Leadership matters. Somebody's got to be the champion internally. I always say it's important to remember that leadership does not have to be positional on these things, right? We have stories from our work at the foundation back in Baltimore where leadership actually came from the middle. Didn't necessarily come from the top. It came from the middle by a group of concerned program officers who knew that we could do better around issues of equity, diversity, inclusion. Broadly embrace messages about why this matters to the work of your organization. This is where I say that this work is mission critical and mission aligned, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is not some initiative off to the side. It's really about how you do your work well and better so everybody can actually succeed. Third, shared definitions and a clear point of view. Again, organizations struggling to be more equitable, to support more diverse populations. When they start that conversation without first doing the work around what are our definitions? What is our point of view about what's driving gender disparities for Black women in infant mortality in our community? What is our theory of change, right? Has to do that work. Organizations have to do that work in terms of definitions and setting their point of view. And again, that's got to be done with community and folks who are most impacted by the issue. Openness to self-reflection, learning, and data. As I mentioned earlier, we all have biases. There's a really, actually, it's a good, the tool is called the Implicit Bias Association Test, and I see some folks are shaking their head yes. I think it came out of Harvard. And you can go online and surprise yourself about some of the things that you have in your head, again, because we've been conditioned and socialized to think certain things about certain people, right? Think certain things about certain people, but this work requires learning, constant learning, and reflection. A manageable place to anchor their commitment in everyday work is critically important. Early positive reinforcements, if we see colleagues stepping out to be a champion on this issue, pat them on the back, support them, because they're probably lonely and need some help. Right? And ensuring, particularly those of us in leadership positions, that we are supporting staff and our team that are trying to do the right thing. They might be struggling, not sure what to do, but let them know that this is the right thing to do. And then finally, to get work started, it's important to rely on external supports. And there are so many, as you all know, resources, tools, information, peers out there that one can call on. Nobody has to recreate the wheel to figure out how to become a better organization as relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. You can call on folks for help. So there's a lot there. And then lastly, what it takes to sustain work over time. And these are just a few thoughts that come out of the D5 study as well. Good results. I mean, we want to, it helps to demonstrate that we are in fact diversifying boards. We are in fact removing practices around hiring, for example, that discriminate against certain people. One of the things that actually we did at the foundation, just as an example, and some of you may be doing this as well, as I was working with the HR department at Casey, we were stripping the resumes of educational institutions, right? Because we knew that certain names of educational institutions carried weight and some didn't. Right? And as we started doing that, taking the time to think about how do we literally sort of sanitize resumes so the normal implicit bias that many of us have doesn't have the opportunity to kick in. And we started seeing more diverse candidate pools and people advancing to interviews. So there are ways in which we can think about this and examples of good results that come from it. Ongoing and broadening leadership commitment, as I mentioned earlier, the leadership doesn't have to be on the top to start the work, but it sure has to be there to sustain it. So over time, we have to have boards committed, we have to have senior leadership committed, and I think there are strategies probably in this room about how to do that. Growing board staff and organizational competencies, extremely important. Many institutions, many of you might be doing it as well, actually periodically or annually take organizational assessments about where they are on some of these issues, and then literally create learning agendas to build competencies. Because where do we learn this stuff? We don't learn necessarily this stuff in school, right? So this isn't blaming any of us that haven't advanced on these issues. And we've got to organize the learning opportunities for ourselves. So many large nonprofits and foundations are doing just that. The next, hardwiring institutional commitment into DEI, or commitment to DEI, and by that I mean, again, make sure it's in policy, board policy, staff policy, investment policy for foundations. And then lastly, systematic data for tracking impact. Data needs to be tracked in terms of how we're doing vis-a-vis staff diversity, board diversity. I think that data should be public. It's actually some of the lessons that have come out of the tech industry where big groups like Google and Facebook, they were getting slammed around their lack of diversity, and they started collecting data and making it much more public so they could take on the challenge. It's like you have to be challenged. Right, you have to be challenged in this work. And one way to do it is not to be concerned or afraid about it. Put the data out there about your board diversity and staff diversity, and the help will come to you. It may come a little hard, but the help will come to you. So systematic data for tracking impact is also important. So I just gave a lot to you in a short amount of time, but I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to any conversations, questions. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks. Okay. Okay.
All right, thank you, Susan. Let's give Susan another round of applause for such an in-depth, comprehensive, very realistic lay of the land on this topic that I think everybody in this room is feeling is necessary right now for the country, for our work environments, for our educational institutions, and certainly for our funding institutions. So what we're going to do for the next few minutes is I'm going to field a few questions with you of things that I've heard my colleagues, some of the students on campus, faculty members, people are wondering about, and get your insight, and then we'll open it up for question and answers to the broader audience. So a lot of what we heard this morning talked about practice. How do we in practice ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then you brought us all the way home about how we sustain it. How do we get an initiative in place, but how do we keep it going? So what I want to ask is, how do we, involved in all of that, make people accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we ensure internally that executive directors and board members are actually being accountable to ensuring that people of color, that the LGBTQIA community is involved, that they are really accountable for ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. One is, I think the last point that I made about getting into the routine of publicizing your data, right? And again, it sounds like something that we would not want to do necessarily, but I truly believe that these things come back at you, and you probably want to take leadership and get out there in front of it. And so one is just be in a routine sort of practice of publicizing your data so you can be in conversation with community about it. The other is, I do think as it relates to foundations can play a big role in working with nonprofits and actually requiring that nonprofits, reflect the community in which they support. There are several foundations that collect data on the demographics of their grantee board and staff, and then the demographics of the communities that they are investing in. And now it's important that foundations are on their own journey as well, right? Sure. So to make this real and authentic. But I think funders, investors actually can take a huge role in ensuring that nonprofit organizations reflect the community. I think it's the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation in North Carolina that actually requires that boards of nonprofits to receive money from them have to reflect the demographic makeup of their community. And if they don't, when they submit their proposal, they get a year to actually develop a plan to diversify that board. And if they don't, within a certain time frame, they can be denied funding. I mean, that's one of the more intentional strategies I've seen. And I guess the last would be, as I said, I think it's important to get in front of these issues because it will come back to you. I think community is extremely important here as well in terms of holding people accountable and organizations, nonprofits and funders accountable, right? And I'm reminded of a story in Chicago last year where an organized community, and so that's why I think we all should be, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we should be thinking about how we get money to groups on the ground that build power in communities that are often marginalized. Because there was such a sight in Chicago last year when there was a picket line in front of the major foundation in that town. And it's because the community actually did its own research and looked at the diversity of the staff, the board, where the money was going, and it didn't look like the south side of Chicago, right? And so community also, I think, plays a big role here, and I'm looking for more and more ways that we support community to hold us as a sector accountable. Yeah.
I agree with you on that. I think that in and of itself brings accountability. Mm-hmm. Once community gets involved, mm-hmm. you're going to be accountable,
mm-hmm.
because those are the folks who oftentimes you're looking as your donor base, mm-hmm. and those folks who are going to be contributors. So mm-hmm. I agree on that. Pivoting from that, do you have a couple of other examples of where you've seen organizations do this diversity, equity, and inclusion well? And what would you say, you gave one example during your last comments, what is it that they did well that allowed them to be kind of successful in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I'm thinking now of a number of foundations in Washington, D.C., the area that I live in, that are very much engaged in deep learning around issues of race and racial equity. And it'll come to me as I'm talking, the name of the foundation, that has taken some intentional steps to diversify their board. And they actually put in place a practice where anybody on the board actually, because it was not at all diverse when they started this journey, could not nominate a board person unless it was 2 or 3 people removed from them, right? And it was a way to push the foundation to get out of its inner social circle and actually led to, more diverse candidates that were quite up for the job and had the expertise and the skill to actually get onto that governance structure. So that's another way. It's like, how do we, and one of the things they did, I think, was turn, again, to some of their grantees and said, who would be good candidates for this board? So the board's not going to nominate, in which most boards operate that way, their colleagues and their network, but they turn to their grantees to get board nominations, and they had to be 2 or 3 people removed from the actual board member itself. It was interesting, and it led to diversity. Yeah.
That is very innovative. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to the audience. You talked a little bit about the importance of culture in supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are all in this space of talking about how you create a culture of learning so that it really is embedded in everybody's intention, because you can have leadership that sets a tone, but folks from the bottom up have to make a commitment to practicing this forward. So tell us a little bit about how we can see culture change towards diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, I do think the issue of policy is important first and foremost, right? That we've got to get these values and principles codified in our institutions. But it's not just about writing a policy, right? Then you got to sort of live through it and really exercise and lean in towards what it means to do work in an inclusive way, right? In a way that is equitable and it doesn't put up barriers for certain folks of difference. And so, again, codifying policy, but then there's got to be leadership that talks about how we bring those policies to life. And that's where, again, the work comes in. My mother always said, that's why they call it work. That's where the work comes in, because it's taken the time to think about, how we do the work that we do. There's an actual tool that we use in the trainings that we do with grant makers. It's called an equity impact analysis. I don't know if any of you have heard of racial equity impact analyses, for example. And it makes you question every policy, look at every program, look at every investment that you're making, and it takes you through a set of questions about how would this impact, not just people of color, Black folks, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans. How would this policy, practice, or decision impact people of different abilities, right? LGBTQ populations. And again, it's doing the work with the self-reflection, and the good news is that there are tools out there, and this equity impact analysis is one of them. It's akin to an environmental impact analysis. Before we do something to the environment, we're going to test what the impact might be. An equity impact analysis suggests before we do something to people, we should test what the impact might be based on difference. And so, again, the more we sort of intentionally take on that kind of work, ultimately will lift up, the ways in which we're working that are often unintentionally just disadvantaging some people because of difference. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And before we pivot to the audience, I want to just mention that ABFE does this training, correct? You actually are available to both deploy staff to organizations to do training, as well as bring people into your offices to conduct training, right?
Yes.
So I want to make sure the audience is aware of that. So let me open it up to the audience. Are there any burning questions that people would like? We have a couple of roving mics, and we'll start with you, Toyce.
Let me get a mic
Here's a
to you.
mic.
My name is Toyce Newton, and I have varied life experiences to start off. I started a nonprofit in a very small rural community, or communities, 5 counties in southeast Arkansas, defined by a lot of things that are not positive necessarily: low educational attainment, economic disparities, and so forth and so on. And I started with that because then I was fortunate enough to serve on the foundation board of the Rockefeller Foundation, which gave me another view into an organization with a different view and different slant. And now I'm back, away from serving in that, back into the community. And while I grasp more the ability of foundations to traverse this environment, I see the difficulty of making the transition into communities that have a varied degree of issues that vary by community. Arkansas is 3 or 4 different states. You got Northwest Arkansas, you have Central Arkansas, you got the Southern Arkansas and the Southeastern Mississippi Delta. So then the challenge is to have the issues of diversity and inclusion and equity addressed, because in one area of the state, people might think that equity equals equality, and those are two entirely different things. So it's translating from the foundation's standpoint or the policy-making standpoints in the community is where, when you say something's lost in translation, so how do we in Arkansas don't lose the message in translation?
Yeah, no, and it's the work of the sector, and I appreciate that, because the condition or the situation that you're talking about, the lost in translation, is happening around the country. I love the fact that you said you were on the board of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation at some point, and I think we've got to be intentional about that. We're doing a lot of work with trustees right now, and it's not just about getting people of diverse background on trustees, but we're trying to get a particular point of view around equity versus equality, right? Everybody gets the same amount of money regardless of what your needs are. That's equality. Versus an equity frame, you get what you need because you are starting at a different place, right? So we've got to put a lot of resources into, I think, board level training and support. The work that we're doing with trustees now, we have now understood and learned that here are the most powerful people in the sector, right, that often don't get connected to conversations like this at all, right? More foundation staff, CEOs, and senior program officers, and even folks in nonprofits that are running programs get access to these kinds of conversations, this kind of professional development. When we're talking to boards, we're talking to folks that are coming because they know how to, their finance background, they're managing money, and it never ceases to amaze me what people don't know about this country. It never, and they're managing billions of dollars. So I think a organized strategy around infiltration of boards, and that means getting people, lived experience on boards, but also we've got to bring along our board members that haven't been exposed to this kind of framework, to the issues, because it's not their lived experience. And one of the things that we've found most successful is getting peers from other foundation boards to talk to other foundation board members, right? So that's where peer-to-peer learning, yeah. So because I can't necessarily connect to a trustee, but if I get a trustee from the Ford Foundation to call a trustee at Rockefeller, they're going to answer that phone call, for example. So I would suggest that we got to start at the top and put more investment there. Folks that are managing billions of dollars don't have the experiences, don't know about this country, and we got to do more in that area, I think. Yeah.
Is there another question? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I want to especially thank you for including class in this conversation, because it's not something I often hear included as part of this conversation. And, specifically, I don't know too many executive directors or board members that are low-income folks. And how do we include class, get more class representation in politics and boards, as part of this conversation? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't remember the data point, but I think it was might have been the Council on Foundations. It was some organization that just looked at the top foundations in this country that were, again, deploying billions of dollars, and looked at the boards and talked about the wealth of the board members themselves that were sitting in many of these institutions. And beyond that, most of them lived in the Northeast, right? And were in fact investing in national programs as well as international programs. So the issue of the lack of diversity across class, across race and gender in boardrooms is a huge issue. And I know I'm going to keep talking about boards, but I think we have to shoot at something that we haven't really sort of focused on before. It's about intentionality. It's about intentionality in terms of, I'm thinking of the Women's Foundation of Colorado, who is run by our friend Lauren Castile. And she just had a number of trustees come to we call it Leverage the Trust. That's our initiative to engage trustees in racial equity work. And the two folks that showed up were community leaders. One's running the governance committee of the board, and I can't remember it might have been, on the investment management committee of the board, which is really the important one for foundations, who's managing the money, right? But that was an intentional, again, strategy by that CEO, who happens to be an African-American woman, and her understanding of how we have to transform and disrupt, right, the privilege in foundations. So all of our organizations that touch community have access to a pipeline. And we've got to work and build that pipeline over time. And I appreciate you sharing the issue of class, because I do think it is a bit of a third rail that often, I don't know if there's anything more comfortable to talk about than race, but class often is an issue when we think about who's making up, constituents in nonprofits, but just in our own experiences at the foundation that we worked at, we would really take to task, to do this job, does somebody really need a college degree, right? And would push back hard on that. So things like stripping those resumes with institutional sort of names as well as degrees, right? And trying to get people to think about what does it really take to run this investment portfolio or to manage the community change work in the city. It doesn't take a PhD to do that. It takes somebody that knows what it's about, because you can't train lived experience. That's natural, right? So continue to shoot at boards, but also there are ways in which I think organizations are trying to be strategic about hiring that is taking on the issue about our implicit bias, and those are the kinds of things that they're doing. So when candidate pools go to the search firm, or that come from the search firm and go to the hiring officials, start making it normal. Now, we're not going to look at, certain things that we know triggers bias, and some are more associated to class and race than others, I think. Yeah. It's a big lift. Yeah.
Another question, Sarah?
Thanks. I'm wondering if you could give some examples of organizations you've seen that have done a good job of embracing an inclusive culture, and maybe what that looked like in practice for them.
Yeah, it's. I think it's important to say that there are starts and stops, for so many organizations, because, going back to the issue around institutionalizing issues in policy, I think are really what the challenge is. So I have to dig deep to think about who's good. I know I was in a conversation with some colleagues, and they were talking about giving gold stars to organizations that were doing great work on, racial inclusion. And I was like, I don't know if I want to give anybody a star, because I know that naturally things change when leadership changes and the like. Right, so I can't at this point identify a organization. I would say that the practices that come to mind are about, again, active inclusion, right? So ensuring that, folks of difference, whether it's, again, by gender, by sexual preference, by race, in fact have important positions, right? Important positions are in seats that have real decision-making power, that basically have power and voice. I think those are some of the things that we need to consider as relates to board and staff. And so as the sort of notes on the slide said, the active inclusion of people, there are ways in which we can ensure that folks that typically don't have a voice are positioned for voice, right? And that they are supported over time. But you lift the issue that, again, I said in the beginning of the talk, I think is the struggle for the organization. One of the things that I figured if I talk long enough, maybe I could think of something. So one of the things that comes to mind, though, is that this notion of affinity groups is important. So as I said, many of our members are the only person of color in their foundation, let alone the only black person in their foundation. And we know now that it's really, really important to connect that professional to a network of support, right? So sometimes, we're sort of relying on the organization to challenge its own ways of being and including people, and we should always do that. There are also ways in which to connect folks that work in your institutions to professional associations, affinity groups. So again, they've got a network of support that they can rely on if it's not necessarily internal to the organization. But this is the work, is around inclusion. Yeah.
Other questions? I thought I saw it. Marty? Oh, I know you got one. Okay. Okay, Marty first, and then we'll go right here. Okay.
Thank you. In a lot of situations in which I talk or have conversations about equity, the immediate thing is raised of displacement. And so how do you overcome people who feel like it's great to add you in, but I shouldn't be displaced in the process because I've done nothing wrong individually, and now when you're adjusting these numbers and formulas, I will ultimately be displaced. And so I hear a lot of times the pushback on equity because then it becomes that conversation of fairness. This is not fair to that individual or this group of individuals. So how do you address or speak to the fear of displacement?
Yeah, it's what this country has done well to us is pit us against each other, right? And that relates to gender, that relates to race. It's the, what do they call it, the crabs in the barrel, right? And so, and the pie, right? And so the first thing, I so appreciate that, sister, the first thing I say is that reject the notion. Just reject it, because it's a power move where folks in privilege try to get us to think that it's a zero-sum game, right? If you gain, I lose. And that is not the case. We have to push to make it right that everybody should win and everybody should gain, right? I love, Angela Glover Blackwell tells a story from PolicyLink about the ability movement several years ago that were about folks with wheelchairs being able to move around free of discrimination and bias. And she talks about how they were so successful, but the work it took to get the little cutouts developed in corners, right, in neighborhoods around the country. And she uses that example to suggest that that was actually done for one population group, folks that were in wheelchairs, right, that had a certain level of ability. Well, who uses those cutouts? Everybody does, right? Young parents with strollers go right for the curb. If I'm walking down the street in Manhattan running from my train, I'll probably knock you over going for the cutout because I'm pulling my suitcase behind me. But there are ways in which we have to lift up examples that it's not a zero-sum game. The pie should be bigger. I know it's the American way that the pie is small. The pie should be bigger, and just to reject this notion of if you win, I lose, because it actually doesn't work that way. I appreciate that. It's real, and we just have to reject it. We have to push it.
Your question in the back? And then we'll come back up toward you.
Thanks. I am I'm the director of a disability organization here in Arkansas, a nonprofit, and so I appreciate your comments on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And the disability community is often disenfranchised in all aspects of, serving on the boards. And you touched on tokenism, and we see quite often within the disability community individuals be appointed to boards, foundations, or whatever, just to fill that slot. And it is like a pat you on the head type of thing. How can we encourage, or what are some recommendations to encourage foundations or boards, or to remove that piece of tokenism? I mean, because there's many individuals with lived experience who want to serve on the boards, who have the capability to serve on the board, but they just need the supports to do so. So what are some recommendations to eliminate those barriers?
There's actually data. I think it was the Center for Effective Philanthropy, CEP, that actually took a really hard look at foundation boards and was raising specifically about racial diversity. But I've seen Board Source come out with similar information about the number of people that you need of a particular population group to change the culture, right? So, and we actually need to lift that up with boards. So if you put one person with different abilities on the board, you put one African American on the board, that's tokenism, pretty much straight up, right? And it's interesting, not that it's science and there's a specific formula, but I remember the Center for Effective Philanthropy data saying you need at least 3 people, right? And when we were talking about racial diversity, 3 people of color on that board to actually start shifting the conversations and the thinking of that board. So I think we've got to get more strategic in using the research that's out there and put that in people's face. I know it's a well-intentioned, sort of invitation to bring one person of that population onto the board, but you have to know that there is data and research that suggests that that person, that will not lead to an inclusive environment, and that, a necessary thing to do is to look at how many folks we need to actually shift culture. So I would suggest using data in a way to help make arguments. Yeah.
Next question here in the front.
Thank you for being here today. I wanted to ask what you thought about something we haven't talked about yet regarding ageism. So what do you think, how do people young and older, how do you think they have a voice to be included on these boards when most likely boards have, include people with tons of experience? How do you think younger people like ourselves, the students here, find a voice for that?
Yeah, this is where, again, I think, who said power concedes nothing without demand, never has, never will. Can't remember what movement leader that was. But younger people, again, folks with difference have to demand change, have to push. Power concedes nothing without demand, never has, never will. I'm going to remember who said that by the time I leave here. Right. But so I think, again, it's about making your voice heard to institutions, to people in power. The level of intentionality is important, as I said. So we're actually in a board recruitment process right now at ADFI. And we've had to stop, look at our diversity matrix. You have to look at your diversity matrix, right? Corey Anderson's on my board, and suggest, we don't have anybody under the age of 40 on our board. And so that's where we need to look. And the example I was talking about with the Women's Foundation of Colorado that really has engaged community leaders as pivotal board members that have certain roles, those were millennials. Both of them were millennials, actually. So level of intentionality is important. A board's got to practice this, looking at who we are, who we support, but then also power concedes nothing without demand. And it's really how does the next generation that has experience, that has lived experience, that has brilliance, because we're nowhere without you guys, to tell you the truth, how you all push and make your voice known, that in order to move the mission, to realize your vision, you need us. or it's a generational strategy and it ends there. I think we got to start talking in those ways. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. We'll take it right here. Student in front.
Thank you again for being here. I'm Chandra. I'm a first-year Clinton School student, and my question is, you mentioned earlier that you cannot take race off the table when talking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in order to create a culture in these organizations and foundations where they are open-minded enough to change policy and protocol, a dialogue has to be created around what can be done, and minds have to be open to things, to the fact that race and gender inequality and sexual orientation discrimination is a problem. So how do you initiate the dialogue if you're a middle person in an organization that wants to point out those issues? And then how do you not sound like a broken record every time you want to talk about or point out how race is involved, because that changes how people perceive your message if they feel that that's all you want to talk about is race, but race is there every time. So
You're speaking my language, yes. So how does one as a middle person move the dialogue? The first thing I would say is get the other middle person and then the other one, and organize yourselves about moving the conversation. Again, I'm going to laugh with Corey and Sharice. We organized so much at Annie E. Casey. I'm going to tell a little story. I know we're live streaming. That we actually had what we refer to as the Underground Railroad. This is how stealth and strategic we've got to be to help these organizations help themselves. And we had a conductor in every unit. We had a point person in every unit. And we convened ourselves, right? And we put together the little dollars that we each had in our portfolios, because we didn't have the big money, right? To actually bring in speakers to create a learning agenda for the organization. So it's really, this work is about organizing. It really is about organizing so you can build power and a collective voice. So I would say find the other middle person and the third middle person and figure out how you work together. In terms of a broken record, there are strategies for white allies in this work, and we've been very strategic about that. A lot of the trainings that we do at our organization, we are intentional about the racial diversity of our training teams, because we know they're speaking to foundations that aren't diverse. And I think there's some reality around who carries the message. And so finding your allies of different racial ethnic groups is important as well. And then just rest. Take care of yourself and rest. You'll do it. Yeah.
One more question. I promised one more. Yes. Yes. Come here. He is, Bob. Right here. Okay.
I wasn't going to say anything, trying to keep my mouth shut. I'm always the amateur in the room. First of all, I love what you said, but I think you left one important point out. This is from somebody who's lived through this. You didn't stress, and of course I've been on the other side of this. I'm older, I'm white, Native American also, but mostly white. So you didn't point out to all these companies, whether for-profit, not-for-profit, charitable institutions, how important it is when you do this, your message, when you actually implement that, how much better it makes that company. Now we've seen that in our company. And the other thing, when you talk about replacing, in 2010 I started speaking about regenerating boards. And so I'm not an expert not-for-profit, but I am an expert in board regeneration. And the hardest thing to do, when we did it with our own board, I was the youngest person on the board. I'm 70 now, okay? So I was the youngest person, all white, all male. And in 2005, we finally found us a really sharp lady, and she's been on the board so much, she's now been term limited out. But the hardest thing to do was to term limit ourselves, because we had really good, talented, hardworking people that were engaged in the board, and it took 2 to 3 years to convince them, it's your time, you need to move aside, we need to get more people in, younger, more diverse, the people that represent our state, and it was difficult, but they all accepted it because it was the right thing to do. I spoke in New Jersey to a board, billion-dollar company, and I looked like a teenager compared to them. The last 3 people that left their board died, okay? So that was their term limit. So, and 4 or 5 of the directors slept through my presentation. It was that boring. Okay. But sometimes seeds take a long time to germinate, and I know nobody wants to hear about patience, but sometimes you have to have it. Well, that board has totally changed, and that's been about 6 or 7 years ago. And last year, I was at another board meeting in South Dakota, and the chairman that had been there for like 15 years and on the board for 25 years finally just said he was going to retire. And I said, "Why are you retiring now?" And he said, "You made me do it. It was your fault." Well, when I spoke to them 2 or 3 years before, it took that long to germinate. So it will take time. And I think when you were talking about replacing, it was replacing a person of color with another person of color. So we're talking about taking a whole old whiteboard and displacing them and bringing a more diverse in. But boy, does it make a difference in the company itself. And it takes more than brains, it takes a heart.
This is head and heart work. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And my attempt around the connection between diversity and better results was, that diverse leaders clearly, better connect to the constituents that they serve. But it's so funny that you talked about term limits. We just came off a board training of a family foundation in Ohio, does great work in about 5 states around the country. It's a white family, and the board are all family members. And so after spending 2 days with this board, the question came up, what's the first thing we're going to do? And the board chair said, put in term limits. And I was like, yes. So your point is valid. I appreciate that. Yeah.
All right, let's give Susan another round of applause. I want to thank everyone for coming today. Please be on the lookout for our 4th installment in our leadership series. It'll be in spring 2019, and this is actually a good pivot to that topic. It will be on succession planning and how to build a stronger nonprofit session. So please be on the lookout for that. Thank you, everyone, for coming.